Hey, y'all. I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, not another podcast. And I agree. I'm typically that person that doesn't listen to podcasts either. But my name is Will Johnson, and I'm here to bring something a little different for you. This is the At Home-ish podcast, creating spaces where we belong. Welcome to episode 15 of the At Home-ish podcast, creating spaces where we belong. So glad you decided to join us today. We have another guest with us, and I'd want to give her the opportunity to tell us a little bit about herself and a little bit about where you're from and what's your role in this community.
Well, greetings, friend. My name is Jay Marie, and I am a pretty seasoned communications professional, having worked with the American Red Cross and your school district, Snohomish, back in the day before starting my own business, doing communications and leadership, training and consulting, process facilitation, and crisis management work.
Okay, yeah, sounds like some pretty intense work you got going there. How'd you get involved in that?
It was really organic. It was a situation where other people saw in me potential and possibilities that I didn't even know to dream about for myself. So I actually, coming out of the community college, needed to get a job, and the local Red Cross was hiring something like a first aid and CPR coordinator. And I popped in for that interview, and the folks who did the interview, within about 10 minutes, excused themselves to go bring in the executive director because they said, we think you need to meet this person. And so I was sitting there putting my eyebrows together can you get in trouble when you're just being interviewed? Feeling like I was kind of being taken to the principal's office.
Right.
But it turns out that they asked if I would have an interest in doing their communications work. And at the time, I had no idea what that meant, but I looked at him and said, I am a hard worker and a fast learner, and I believe in the mission, and I would be delighted to do whatever you all see, think I would be a good fit for. And fortunately, the Red Cross has an incredible training program because most of their folks who do the work are volunteers. And so in order to ensure consistency, they provide extensive education and training. And so I learned about the role, the official function of communications. I've been a communicator since I was teeny, but the official, how do you communicate organizationally? How do you bring a community together around complicated issues? How do you talk about and motivate people to care about things that might be complex? And so I cut my teeth with the Red Cross, and then a little later worked for public schools. And as you know, anything that happens out in the larger community shows up in public schools. And so through that work, really gained a much deeper understanding of the issues that matter in any community, but specifically in our Snohomish community.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome, because one of the things that really stood out to me about what you were saying is someone saw something in you and then brought you into this opportunity.
They did. They actually created the job. They said, well, the Red Cross, Snohomish County Red Cross at that time didn't have a communications person, but it was getting large enough that they needed one. So they actually created the job and put me into it based on what they saw in me in that interview, and then trained and cared for me professionally to help my skills meet my aptitudes.
And so when I think about equity and inclusion, helping you to develop those skills, meeting a need, and then inclusion, creating the opportunity, that the act of inclusion through that creation is just powerful. And of course, when we talk about spaces where we belong, I'm sure that really created a climate and culture where you felt like you belonged there, right?
I did. And the folks there who were, my coworkers and bosses, very much kind of put me under their wings and helped me build my skills to be able to be an employee, to be able to represent an organization professionally out to the larger community. And one of the things the Red Cross is known for is equity, meeting the needs of all, regardless of their demographic, political, or other orientations or backgrounds. And another one of their callings is universality, being that everyone is welcome and everyone will be treated with respect and care in an equitable way.
That's awesome. So we want to ask this question. It might seem a little simple, but What is it that you enjoy most about the work that you do now?
There are a handful of things that come to mind. Intellectually, one of the things I love is taking really complicated issues and simplifying it. Not, sometimes people think that, you're simplifying a message that's because you think the audience won't understand the complexity. And that's not my standpoint at all. My standpoint is that all of us in today's society are really busy, are really inundated with messaging and information. And if we, in any particular organization or within a particular calling, if we are motivated for other people to understand what we're talking about, then it is in our interest to make it easy for others to understand and for them to be able to understand it quickly without having to go digging for it. If an individual wants information, then they're motivated. They'll go out and they'll get it and they'll dig into complexity at their own pace. But if we're the ones motivated to push information out, then the onus is on us to make it appealing, to draw the connection between my message and your values. And so that aspect of simplifying complexity and understanding the people I'm reaching out to well enough to be able to make it meaningful to them. So intellectually, that is very appealing to me. On a moral and spiritual level, I absolutely believe in the power of public education. A former Washington governor, Gary Locke, talked about public education as being the great equalizer. And I believe that to be true, that education is at an intersection of democracy in two ways. One, you need to have a well-educated populace in order to be able to engage meaningfully in democracy. But also, a lot of times across the United States, public schools are the largest employer. They are perhaps the most obvious face of democracy in that, when we think about democratic activity, and right now in this highly polarized time that we're in, the idea that I could go change the conversation at the national level is really hard to imagine, right? It's like a hurricane at the national level. Just like, it's not people talking with each other, it's people talking at each other, right? And so how do you meaningfully influence that? It's really hard to imagine that.
Right.
Even at the state level, Will, you and I are both well connected with educational leaders across the state. And realistically, we would have to make it our life's calling to have even a little bit of an influence in terms of really shifting the needle at even at the state level. But when it gets to the local school district, the local fire district, those local government agencies, that's the place where the average citizen who doesn't have to be well connected can show up and make a difference. But in order for those average citizens to feel welcomed, to feel that they belong, to feel empowered, that their voice matters, school leaders need to continue to become more skilled at how we listen to the public, and not just how we listen to them, but how we demonstrate that we have listened. So whenever I get to work with a room full of superintendents or get to collaborate with school communications colleagues to help increase local schools' ability to meaningfully engage, not just check a box or, give the surface appearance of a conversation, but to actually engage people with a diverse set of backgrounds and perspectives and bring them together in a way that they can actually talk with each other, not at each other, and that they can influence direction. That, as a woman who believes in democracy and believes in that, I think each of us should have a voice in what happens to us. My cousin who's in the disability rights community would say, nothing happens to us that's not with us, nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
So for me to have been invited in and cared for into this line of work that lets me actually help other people build the ability to do that is morally and spiritually, it feeds my soul.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was a powerful testament for what you get to do.
Yes, and get to do is the right phrasing on it. It does feel, it's hard work too, but it's joyful work. It's important.
Yeah. What would you say have been some of your greatest successes in this work?
Hmm. I think during my time in the Snohomish School District, I was a part of this community at a time when it had been 15 or more years since the community had invested in the facilities of its schools.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of angst within the school system about whether or not they trusted school leaders enough to vote yes for bonds to build new schools. And I worked with a really strong team of school leaders to help shift that conversation and to make it possible for Snohomish to go from a one high school town, one comprehensive high school plus the alternative program, to a two comprehensive high school and alternative program community. And there's just a lot of underlying complexity related to that. And in that process, the superintendent and other school leaders and I were a part of, gosh, it's been a long time, but I think it was like 83 public meetings.
Oh, wow.
And we essentially said, we will come. If you want to host a meeting in your living room and bring your neighbors, we'll come join you. If you want to invite us, we'll be there. And that was a genuine turning point for the Snohomish community, and to have been a small part of that over 2 election cycles and to pass between the bonds themselves and the state matching funds, it was almost $500 million worth of school construction money that became available to, build a new high school, rebuild the historic high school, build a couple of elementaries, and do some other work as well. And so that was really meaningful to me. I've done some really important work with the team up in Bellingham Public Schools, including being trusted to go in and support them after the unexpected death of their communications leader. And I was trusted to go in and support their team through that important transition. And that was beautiful and meaningful. And then in a completely different arena, I do a lot of facilitation for utilities in the region. And that involves conversations between the utilities, state and federal agencies, local agencies, tribes, and other interested like nonprofits. And, some of that work has resulted in hundreds of acres of habitat that's now managed for different wildlife that were affected by the operations of those utilities. And my opportunity to learn about tribal history and how that plays out, things that that aren't necessarily known by the general public today, but have deep meaning to tribal members in our region. It's been a real honor to get to learn more about that and to support, to your point and to your focus, creating conditions where everybody genuinely belongs at the table, where those voices that might see the same issue from very different lenses, they are empowered to make decisions together in a genuine way. And so to get to be a part of that is joyful too.
That's awesome. We'll have to come back to that history point in a minute. But I do want to ask another related question about challenges. What have been some of the challenges that you've encountered in this role or in the roles you've served in?
All of the things that I didn't know that I didn't know. It has been a joyful challenge to broaden my own understanding of why people bring the different perspectives to the table that they bring. One of my former colleagues and bosses used to talk about, making room in your own heart to be open to the legitimacy of another person's perspective. And that by doing so with integrity and sincerity doesn't mean that I've got to agree with that other perspective at the end of the day. But it means that I have opened myself up to the possibility that even though this other person sees something entirely differently than I do, that their view is equally legitimate as mine. As a teenager, I had a real strong need to be right. I was afraid that if I were right.
Really?
I was a good arguer. And I think underneath that argumentativeness, and it's not that I was an overly argumentative person, but I could get my heels dug in on something and maybe have a hard time changing my perspective. And as I've gotten older, I look back at that and I see that that's really a fear. That comes from a place of fear that, what does it mean if it turns out I was wrong?
Right.
Does that mean something bad about me as a person, or is it simply that was the knowledge that I had at that time and now I have new knowledge? But making that shift, I think, has been one of the most important challenges and most rewarding. I think I am a much more approachable person. I think I am much more, yeah, my brain went in a different direction. Sorry. Yeah.
All good, but I do appreciate how you're saying growing through those challenges. Because I think sometimes, the question pops up about, oh, here's this challenge. It's like, so then what came out of that? What was their growth? Is there a continued challenge? Like, where is it now? And so, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important for us to give ourselves grace to be able to acknowledge new information, including new information about what matters to other people. And if we're hooked in on the idea that we have to be right, or that if we were wrong, that's somehow a moral failing or a judgment about us, then it's a lot harder to broaden our perspective and see and be willing to, as my former boss said, be vulnerable to the legitimacy of somebody else's view.
Yeah.
But if we give ourselves grace, if we say it's okay to have been wrong, that we did the best we could with what we knew at the time. And as Maya Angelou said, when you know better, do better.
Hey, exactly. Yeah.
But that requires a certain amount of grace to be able to acknowledge that I now know better than I did before. And that it's, to give ourselves kindness for the things that we were unaware of or ignorant to in the past.
Absolutely. And so my next question for you is like, how does the belonging show up or influence your life?
I am deeply grateful for and sometimes humbled by the ways in which other people will welcome me in. I have had the opportunity to be present as tribal elders, talked through very challenging issues of their own identity and their tribe's identity and their personal and collective values. And the fact that they let me be in the room for those conversations was a real gift. And that's just one example. I've been in the room, in the wake of tragedies, and as families have dealt with, really painful information, and they've trusted me to be there as they process that painful information. So that sense of belonging, and that is a gift that we give one another, it feels like a gift. I think in the same way that others have extended that gift to me of letting me belong in their very personal spaces, that's what I want to do for others. I want to be someone that extends the welcome mat really fully.
Well, I absolutely see that in you, because just as we were talking the other day, we've only known each other for just over a year, but I recall during last year's Pride Parade that I was introduced to you, and then I didn't even really know that you were like right behind me or next to me until we started moving, and you're right there, and it was like, oh, and it was I just felt so welcome, so supported, so connected at that time, and it's like it kind of radiates from you.
Well, that's delightful. I'm glad for that.
Yeah. So many good nuggets there. But like as I mentioned, I did want to jump back on, what you were saying about history and deeper meaning, as well as, what we don't know. Because we had an interesting conversation the other day.
Yes, we did. I loved that material you sent my way.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Little Kendrick Lamar, and then the whole thing about the booster rockets.
Right.
Can you share what we learned about the booster rockets?
So this is a little nugget that runs around the internet every once in a while. But before I learned about it the first time, I never would have seen these connections. So it turns out that the size of the rockets that sent the old space shuttles up into space was determined in part by the width of a Roman horse. And that all goes back to, literally thousands of years, to the size of Roman chariots, which was determined by the width of two horses. And those Roman chariots over time dug grooves into the land all around Europe. Then later, as technologies improved and people developed different kinds of wheeled vehicles, it was smart to make those future iteration of wheeled vehicles the same width, because if you had a slightly narrower or slightly wider width, the odds that one wheel or the other would fall into the rut and then could break the axle
Right.
were really high. So then, hundreds of years later, they're making wagons the same width as Roman chariots because those grooves were already established. Well, then fast forward a few hundred more years. And when it comes time to make trains and to determine the width of the rails on trains, it made sense to use that same width. And so trains in the early North American region were built on the same specs as the trains in Europe, which go back to the width of a Roman horse's backside.
Right.
And then those train widths ultimately influenced road widths and whatnot, and tunnel widths. And when we fast forward to the previous century and current century work around getting up into space, some things were manufactured in one part of the country, but then needed to be transported to another part of the country. And so they needed to be able to fit these things through these tunnels. And so they ultimately made these booster, not the engines, but I'm forgetting
the rocket, the booster rocket.
The rocket itself, the container for the fuel. They wanted to make it as large as possible, but it had to as large as could possibly fit through those tunnels.
Right.
And so who'd have thought that, the size of something being shot off into space from Cape Canaveral ultimately goes back to these things that are hidden now,
right?
All the way back to Roman times.
Yeah, and it's so crazy when I read that, because the whole concept of thinking about acknowledging what we don't know and having that grace to process new information, but then understanding through that story of how something's millennia old still influences what we do today.
And in fact, part of what we were talking about that made the conversation so rich was not only are those hidden bits of history powerful for the ways that they shape what we're doing today, but in some ways they are more powerful because they are hidden.
Right.
And when we start looking at things that have to do with social justice and equity, those things that aren't well known by the majority culture, but absolutely affect the economics and opportunities of Black Americans, of Native Americans, of Hispanic Americans, and yet white Americans, if they don't know that history of things like redlining and how groups were intentionally economically disadvantaged for generations, it can be very easy for someone who is white today to think, well, I had to work hard for what I got. And that is true. I'm thinking about some of my loved ones who, they ran 2 and 3 businesses as young adults, and they helped their kids to do summer jobs and whatnot to earn the resources to go to college and, to have all of those opportunities. Those opportunities weren't just handed to them. They did work for them. But if they aren't aware of the ways in which their peers were kept from those generational opportunities, it can be easy to tell yourself that, oh, this was on, we were all on equal footing and I got these benefits because I worked hard for them.
Yeah.
Well, other people worked hard as well, but didn't start from the same place and don't have the same opportunities, in part because of aspects of our history that we don't see. And by the fact that we don't see them, it's insidious, the way that it has power over the ongoing gaps in equity. And I think this circles back to my bosses saying, can we make ourselves vulnerable to the legitimacy of somebody else's perspective? Can we be willing to learn something that makes us a little uncomfortable? Because maybe it means that while, yes, I did work hard for every opportunity, maybe I also had some blessings that were not equally available to my peers. And while I'm not responsible for the decisions made a generation ago or 2 generations or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, I'm not responsible for those decisions. And I don't need to feel guilty for those decisions. But I think it is incumbent on us to become aware of them and to help rectify the ongoing effects of those, what are now hidden decisions.
Right. Absolutely. Something that resonated with me just now was when you were talking about other perspectives, because As you were talking about opportunities that may be provided for someone because of how they identify, I'm forced to think about, someone from a marginalized community who may now be going through life thinking, oh, I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I could never attain, or I could never go through the process that someone else did. And so if I want to attain, I have to do it through other means, and so just some of that hidden programming, if we want to call it that leads to certain behaviors and interactions between communities.
Well, what you just said sends me down an entirely different nerdy rabbit hole.
Okay. We like nerdy routes.
So I also, for years, I used to attend this systems thinking conference that was held down at Pratt & Whitney. So back to space shuttles, because I'm ultimately a bit of a space nerd. This group of rocket scientists and engineers would host this conference that was all about thinking about how we think.
Okay.
And it was one of the most joyful events I would go to each year. And they would have it was like a room full of Renaissance people, people who are scientifically nerdy, socially interested, organizational development experts. One year we had a presentation by a guy who was literally a cowboy poet who spoke 5 languages, including Chinese and Russian, and came walking into the room wearing his 10-gallon hat and playing a fiddle before he dropped some incredible pearls on us. But one of the presenters there talked about the ways in which our brain processes visual information, and that there are a number of visual processing errors that often get misunderstood as intellectual disabilities, or can come across as someone not having the same intellectual capacities, when actually it's that the connection between how their eyes are focusing or how their eyes and brain communicate is affecting their perception and ability to interpret and respond to the world. And there's a whole lot. I mean, this particular session was an all-day session, so I'm just going to pull a couple nuggets from it here.
Okay.
But one of them was that some of the other thing that's important to know about some of these visual processing errors is that they are shockingly easy to repair. Like, you can do eye exercises such as holding a string with one hand out as far away from your hand as possible and holding the other end of the string at your nose and having a couple of beads on the string at different places and spending time just focusing your eyes on each different bead in order to train your eyes to be able to focus together, because maybe one eye is not as strong and so it tends to not focus, and that can cause reading impairments, for instance. So it can be as simple as spending a few minutes every day focusing on beads on a string to resolve this visual processing error, which then makes it possible to read smoothly. Whereas prior to that, the person might have been interpreted as being unable to read because maybe they had an IQ issue, right? And when the researchers realized the frequency with which we humans sometimes have these visual processing errors and how often they're misinterpreted to mean something else, they got really curious about that. And they went into juvenile detention facilities and they tested kids for visual processing errors. And they found, and it's been so many years, I don't want to drop percentages, but a shockingly high percentage of kids in juvenile detention facilities had visual processing errors that were relatively easy to fix.
Right.
And what this presenter talked about was how it made perfect sense to her that kids who, because we start labeling kids in the very earliest grades, right? Like we start tracking a kid. Are you a good reader? Do you need remedial help? And then not only what story do we adults tell ourselves about the kids who need remedial help, but what story did the kids tell themselves and each other about the kids who need remedial help, right? And so she said, how many of these, like there was one story she shared in particular of a young man who was in his late teens who couldn't read and thought he was stupid. And he gets this test and he finds out that, no, it's not about my intelligence. It's that my eyes weren't teaming correctly. My eyes weren't focusing correctly on the letters. And once that was fixed, he picked up reading just like that. And when he talked to her about it later, he threw papers across the room out of just sheer frustration. He's like, I checked out of school entirely because I thought I was stupid.
Right.
And then you look at, so I mean, to your earlier point about, you know, what we tell ourselves, what meaning we make of those kinds of things, and how do we think that we belong, and what do the stories that we tell ourselves at a very early age, how do they play out later? And it turned out that, you know, then one of the things they did after that initial study of how many kids have a visual processing error was they then went and provided those kids with the therapy they needed to fix the visual processing error. And then 10 years later, they went back and they looked at what were the recidivism rates of, you know, how often did the kids end up back in the criminal justice system? And again, I don't remember the percentages because it's been so long, but the kids who got that help of fixing their visual processing error, and more importantly, got the message that they were not stupid, but that it was a simple thing that could be easily fixed, their recidivism rate was just slashed.
Right.
Massive.
Makes sense. Because when I even think about when I was teaching in a high school behavior program, I really struggled with students where it's from a deficit-based mindset of what they can't do, you know, and they're really trying to focus on what they can. But just like kind of what you're saying, if a student or person in general has something that's impacting their ability to process things visually or even audibly, you know, it can impact their beliefs around their ability to learn and be successful. And it's cooler to be the bad kid than the kid who's struggling.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Which also circles back to something else we've talked about, which is our shared frustration with how often school systems and society in general, we label a kid who's having behavioral challenges as being bad.
Right.
We don't look at a kid who's struggling with math and go, that's a bad kid, right? We think that's a kid who needs some remedial support with math.
Right.
But we look at a kid who struggles with patience or has a hard time listening or doesn't yet have skills for how to navigate big feelings like anger and frustration. And those kinds of struggles are more likely to get a kid labeled as being a bad person or a challenge or a difficult person than struggles with math or science. But the reality is those interpersonal skills are all just as learnable and teachable as math, science, and reading. And I think we as a society would be doing kids and ultimately our collective selves a big service to remember that all of these human skills are just that. They are skills. We can all get better at them. And bringing it back to belonging, to look at things like that through a lens of skill building and ability makes it much easier for us to keep the circle big, to stop othering these kids who just need a little support, building some personal skills.
Yeah. You know, one thing that my mind came across with what you were saying when we're talking about belonging, and I know I've mentioned this before, the concept that belonging is mutual, you know, and so I think about some work that I've seen in schools or, you know, whether it was in research and maybe not implemented, but we won't go into that right now. But, you know, some of the work around creating those environments for belonging, those dynamic learning environments, classrooms, but then students, for whatever number of reason, still not being able to engage or feel like they belong. And that made me think about our recent conversation. And I'm going to jump right off into the shave and a haircut 2 bits.
Yes, please.
Because
dun, 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 dun.
Because up until very recently, what was it? Was it Saturday? Well, either way, a couple of days ago, so my cable's out. I can't I can't binge watch Netflix right now. Kind of disappointed in that. But
so you had to go learn stuff?
I had to go learn stuff because the TV wasn't working. In a recent song by Kendrick Lamar, Not Like Us, which is just blowing up the airwaves, there was a video on Instagram breaking down the video and some of the things that he talks about in the song, and even some of the chords in the song. But they reference the shave and a haircut 2 bits, which is also the knock from the beginning of the video. And I did not know the origin of where that came from.
I didn't either.
But it came from a song back in 1899. And the song was called A Dark Town Cakewalk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, I'm not going to lie. When I first read Dark Town, I kind of had a feeling go through my body.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, Will, what's a dark town?
I want to pause for just a second and ask when a feeling like that, like tell your listeners more about what that feeling is and like, where do you feel it in your body?
Oh, I feel it like right above my gut. And then maybe there's some chills on the back of my neck and in my arms, because a term like dark town for me, it makes me think about like the sundown towns where if you had dark skin, you better not be in town, you
Right.
know?
And it was a matter of physical safety.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so with that being a part of, let's still call it our recent history, it just, gives me feelings of am I safe? Am I okay? Who can I trust? But when I saw Dark Town specifically, it's like, oh, so well, that's actually a dark town, which would be the opposite of a sundown town. And what I learned, and I grew up in Atlanta, did not know this. There was an area of Atlanta, and it was actually the same area where Dr. King's house is, that was called Dark Town. And that was where the African American people lived. And it was a safe neighborhood where people could, when they were visiting the town, they could go there and they know they'd be safe.
Mm.
Now, when we talk about Dark Town Cakewalk, ooh. So I know most people have heard the term cakewalk as something that's easy, but with this song, A Dark Town Cakewalk, the cakewalk was actually more of a performance, like a minstrel show type performance where cake was the prize. So in A Dark Town Cakewalk, it was basically African Americans dancing and performing, kind of making a mockery of the elite rich for their entertainment, with the prize being cake.
But also sort of self-deprecating, right? Like there is a lot of expected buffoonery and...
Can we even say current hip hop? I mean, that's a whole different episode, because I think there's so much stuff in our society that it makes a mockery of ourselves and culture that just really impacts that concept of mutual belonging. And so the reason why I wanted to go down that road of the shave and a haircut 2 bits is there are things similar to the horse's rear end, things that are so ingrained in our society that are hidden. We're unaware of it, but it influences so many things that happen today. And while there are people who are aware of these things, and with that knowledge comes that fear of, do you not know what this means? Do you not know what's being said? Like, why are we doing this thing? I don't feel safe. I don't feel like I can trust you. I don't want to engage, because this isn't a place where I feel it's really in my best interest.
And maybe it's even, this is a place where you, the collective you of whatever,
you.
haven't invested enough care, haven't cared enough about my history or my people's history to raise that level of awareness and therefore change behavior.
Right. Well, let's take it another way. Not only is there perhaps that feeling of people not caring to raise the awareness, but aren't there movements to ban conversations about even having this awareness?
Right.
And so what does that communicate to people?
Well, I think it communicates on multiple levels, because not only are those efforts to ban topics, do they have a purpose in the current moment to either further marginalize or at least sustain marginalization of some members of our community. But I think it's more insidious than that. I think it is with a long view of looking at, by suppressing that collective knowledge of our shared history, you continue forward with that. What is the effect 50, 60, 100 years from now if the majority culture doesn't know how we got to the places that we've gotten to.
Right. Well, now I'm even thinking about just, where we are today in the sense of when this history was happening, people were aware of it, but here's the story they're going to tell. So it's like, it's not new that they're trying to bury or ban the history. It's been hidden. And now that it's coming to the surface with all the access to information that we have, well, now, hey, let's throw some more dirt on that. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of like good-hearted people in the majority culture are afraid of the idea. I said earlier, my personal view, and it's what makes it easier for me to become vulnerable to the legitimacy of other people's experience and story, is that I am not responsible for the decisions that were made in the past. Being really clear about that makes it easier for me to learn about those decisions and to learn about the breadth of our American and world history. I think if you haven't given time to actually think that through and realize, no, I'm not responsible for other people's choices. I'm not responsible for my grandparents or my great-grandparents or my ancestors all the way back. I'm not responsible for their choices. I am responsible for mine.
For sure.
But I think many of us feel, it's kind of couched in family loyalty and cultural loyalty and pride and patriotism and pride in our country and things like that. Feel like if we acknowledge those darker parts of history, does that mean that I have to feel guilty for it or that I have to feel bad about somebody else's choices? And I think that sense of, I think people are afraid of having to feel guilty or feel bad. Like life is heavy and hard enough. And so then I think good-hearted people kind of push away wanting to know more of these harder historic facts. Because what does it mean? What does it say about me and my people or my lineage if I now know about those things?
Right. But that's at the cost of building trust and relationships with the groups of people who are so severely impacted by it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ultimately, there's a richness to becoming the type of person that is genuinely welcoming and broadens our circle and therefore then also becomes genuinely welcomed. Some of my, you asked earlier in this podcast about some really meaningful moments. And the ones that came to mind for me were times when I was trusted to get to experience something intimate to a group, either intellectually intimate or an emotionally significant moment, and that I was welcomed into that space. And I attribute that to my willingness to be vulnerable and to learn uncomfortable truths. And so I would encourage others to do this same, every one of us has a different journey. So it's not the same work, but to do the work, to be more willing and able to engage in other people's truths, to be vulnerable to the legitimacy of other people's truths, because it's really pretty beautiful.
Yeah. And one thing I think about is, we can talk about having those uncomfortable conversations, but the more we have them, the more we get comfortable with them.
Right? The less uncomfortable they become.
Right.
Yeah.
So we can't avoid it.
Well, and that's a little, one of my other heroes is Mr. Rogers, right? And he talks about anything human can be talked about, and anything that we can talk about, we can deal with. And anything that's happening for any of us is a human thing, which means we can talk about anything and we can deal with anything.
My music brain's going crazy because even though the song's totally not connected, I was like, all right, let's give them something to talk about.
Nice. Yeah. Good title, different storyline, but very apropos title.
Yes. And as much as I can, even when we're dealing with topics that some people may perceive as challenging, I like to try to, keep it as lighthearted and accessible as possible. Because one of the nuggets I feel you shared was about making information accessible to people. If people don't have access to it, or access is strenuous or difficult, then how can we expect them to really take in and process that information? Yeah. So a lot of good stuff here today. My page is full. I loved your opening where we were talking about people seeing something in you. And so I think call to action for our listeners is, to be observant with the people around you and create spaces where they can grow and bring them in. Another one was about that whole access to information. We can't expect people to grow and learn if we don't make the information accessible to them. Education is also an equalizer. So the more we learn, don't ban education. Don't say that we can't learn certain things. Education is the equalizer that can help us to move forward. Yeah.
And I think if I were going to add just one more kind of really foundational idea.
Okay, one more. What you got?
Yes. So in Cambodia, there's a saying that you see everywhere. It's on bumper stickers, it's on T-shirts, and it's often written in English. So it's pretty clearly intended to be for the travelers there.
Oh, okay.
Locals will say it, and they say it in kind of a sing-song voice with a little bit of sense of humor, and they'll go, same,
Yes.
but different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of power in that and I interpreted that to mean we all are dealing with the same big ideas. We all want to feel like we belong.
Mm-hmm.
We all have known love. We all have known rejection. We've all known anger, betrayal, right? All these big things. Most or all of us have experienced that. The details are different.
Right.
But the big ideas of these human experiences are the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we've talked a bit about belonging in terms of kids in classrooms and what stories they tell each other. But I think if we take that all the way back up to adults, we are not going to shrink the big gaps in our polarized community by continuing to head off to our separate corners and yell at each other across that, right?
No.
To your point about the more we have uncomfortable conversations, the less uncomfortable they get. And I think one of the ways to get people to be willing and able to deal with some of these hard conversations is to start from places that we have in common.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's part of your work, as a DEI director. It's about belonging. How do we focus on what we have in common? How do we bring the conservative and the progressive parts of Snohomish together to have a conversation about what education should look like? Because we got a lot of values in common across that political spectrum that don't make it onto the TV news because it's more exciting to talk about how we're different and to yell at each other about how we're different. But the reality is we've got a lot in common, and that can be the place that we start the conversation that leads us to making room for the legitimacy of each other's perspective. Start from what we have in common, look for that common ground, and then explore where things are different and do that exploration with a sense of grace for ourselves and for each other.
Yeah. I can't even express how many times during that first year when I introduced myself, I would very early in the conversation say, oh, yes, I served in the Army. And very shortly after that, I would see people's shoulders soften, facial expressions change. Thank you for your service. Okay, now that we have that in common, here's how we're going to move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. You don't yell at someone for how they're different. You start out with, right?
Right.
That's not gonna bring people in to want to be vulnerable.
Yeah, find that common ground. Yeah.
And express appreciation for, starting from what we have in common, but then express appreciation for where those differences bring something positive to the community.
Yeah. So I think we're getting close to our time here, and I did share some nuggets already, but this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here today.
It has been lovely. Thank you for having me and for continuing to explore these rich and meaty topics. It's a real joy to get to think together with you and to continue to talk about these things.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to more of that. So as we get ready to wrap up here, I do have to, express that I'm only 15 episodes in now. One more to go in this season, and then I've been on a couple other podcasts. But if you have been patient and attentive and an engaged listener, you've probably heard some of the same types of messages time and time again. But, if it sounds familiar, it's because this is the core work. This is where we need to lay our foundation to actually work to make a difference in our communities. It's not always overly complicated, but if we show up, if we communicate, if we create space, those are some of the primary keys to really help us to be better humans. And so now you go back and listen to every episode and find out some of those key points, but it's in there, you know. I do have another question that I've added in lately, just because, you know, I used to DJ and music's kind of my jam. And so, Jay Marie.
Yes, sir.
If you were to walk into a room, what would be your theme music that would play?
There is a song by Dave Matthews, Mercy. And it speaks to that idea of having mercy for ourselves and each other. There's also a thread throughout that song that speaks to essentially, you know, it says, you know, we can't just fall down and wait for God to fix these things, that it's up to us, that, you know, we've got to show up. And, you know, he doesn't use Gandhi's words exactly, but the theme is very strong that we have to be the change we want to see in the world. We've got to show up with a sense of mercy and care. And so I think that would be my theme song.
Wow. You're hitting me heavy with some of the quotes today. Got the Gandhi in there, throw a little bit of Maya Angelou in there. Thank
There's
you.
a lot of wisdom in this world.
Ooh, so much wisdom, which also means that a lot of the stuff that we're going through in the world, it's not new. It's been around for decades, centuries, millennia, and we have to work to figure this out. Yeah. And I love the Maya quote where when we know better, we do better, because that, of course, is the basis for my closing line. When we wise up, we rise up. Thank you so much for listening and being here. And don't forget to stop by the Snohomish Apothecary, pick up some merch. Don't forget to stop by the website. You can order merch on there. Check out our consulting that we have on there. There's just so many things that you can have access to. Check out the Instagram to interact with me personally, because I spend entirely too much time on there. I will reply to your messages. We want to continue this conversation and keep the work going. So thank you so much for being here, and peace out.